The religious love to claim that they can prove God, but in practice, they never ever can. Why? Because they're only trying to prove God to people who already believe in God, not to anyone who doesn't take their silly preconceptions seriously. They're just ignorant, which is hardly a surprise. But at least we have to give them a chance to make fools of themselves, right? Because that's really all they do. So let's do exactly that coming up next. This time, we get to hear directly from God, or at least that's the name of the channel. It's a pretty decently sized channel, but this particular video, it's not doing well. It's called How to Easily, and yes, that word is in all caps, How to Easily Prove God to an Atheist. And its downvotes outnumber its upvotes by at least 2 to 1, at least as I'm writing this. I don't think we're going to be very impressed here, do you? So let's check in and see, because maybe we'll come out the other side as Christians. I don't know. I wouldn't hold my breath on it, but hey, anything's possible, right?
Believing in the existence of God is a complex matter for humans.
Not really. All you need is a lot of ignorance, a fair bit of gullibility, and people telling nonsensical stories that provide emotionally comforting narratives to other people who really want to believe. It's when any of those things evaporate that religion goes away. I'm not so worried about the complexity part. I care only about the truth. If there actually is a God of any kind, I want to know about it. If I am not convinced that any gods of any kind are actually real, I am not going to believe. It's that simple. I'm not resistant to the idea. I just care if it's actually defensible, rationally, logically, and evidentially. And so far, at least, it simply isn't. Maybe this video is going to change my mind, because it's called How to Easily, in all caps, Prove God to an Atheist. And the all caps never impresses anybody, I'll tell you right now. So, okay, I'm game. Go right ahead.
It's a question that crosses everyone's minds at least once in their lifetime. While some, like atheists, assert that there is no God.
No, we don't. If you can't even get that right, then you're already off on the wrong foot. We do not necessarily assert that there are no gods. We are simply not convinced that there are. There is a difference that the religious by and large refuse to acknowledge. Why? Because mostly they're too busy preaching to the choir, and it's a lot easier for them to just cast atheism as their polar opposite, instead of recognizing that atheists are just people who honestly don't believe because they have no evidence to convince them that any of it is true. They'd have to be honest to admit that, and I think we know better than that, don't we?
It raises the question, do they possess concrete evidence supporting the absence of God?
No, and we don't claim to. This is why they invent the straw man, to push their own evidential responsibilities off onto others. This is where the dishonesty comes in. If they were going to be honest, and we know they're not, they'd realize that they have their own burden of proof regardless of what anybody else has. They are claiming a God is real after all. That carries a burden of proof that they are incapable of meeting. It doesn't matter what any individual atheist may or may not say. That doesn't diminish their own responsibilities, and they are desperately trying to run around with the goalposts to get away from it. So why don't you try for a little bit of honesty here? Because that would be a novel change of pace.
Can they claim they know everything about the universe and arrive at such a conclusion after comprehending its entirety? This seems like a blow to their egos, and if atheists are honest with themselves, they may recognize this flaw and transition to agnosticism.
That is not what that word means. However, it doesn't actually matter. I'm also an agnostic. I don't claim to know whether gods exist or not, because I don't have any evidence to support the non-existence of things, because non-existent things don't tend to leave any evidence behind. Yet I am still an atheist in that I don't believe in any gods because I have not been convinced that any gods actually exist. Convince me and I'll stop being an atheist. Don't and I won't. It's that simple. Because the simple fact remains that agnostics still don't believe in any of these gods, which of course makes them atheists. I think it's just a less threatening word for the religious, like they're on the fence about it and they just might be convinced, whereas atheism sounds mean or something. It just proves how ignorant the religious actually are. And that's not exactly a surprise, is it?
A stance of uncertainty about the existence of God, counteracting an atheist's logic, may seem challenging, but it's not impossible. In today's video, I'll share straightforward methods to prove that God does exist.
And I bet that he won't. Here's a problem that the religious tend to have, at least in my opinion. Feel free to disagree down in the comments if you'd like, but I have seen this time and time again. They present arguments that would sound perfectly fine to an existing theist, but are just bullshit to everybody else. If you don't start with the preconceived notion that the religious have, then they're not going to convince you at all. They will not convince anybody with a brain that any of the things the religious say are true. Of course, the religious aren't looking for anyone with a brain. People with brains who care about rational reality, those people don't tend to convert, do they? Which is why they don't want to talk to us. They're perfectly happy to talk about us, or at least their straw man version of us, where they just get to make stuff up and invent nonsensical boogeymen, but they don't want to have an actual back and forth rational conversation with us. It reveals the utter bankruptcy of their position. But then again, what else is new?
You've likely encountered someone who, when you shared your faith, mentioned not believing in God, and chances are that you found it difficult to prove to them that God indeed did exist.
Because sharing your faith doesn't prove anything to anyone. Theistic story time isn't impressive to people who don't already believe. We don't want to hear your testimony. We don't want to hear how what you believe makes you feel. We want to see your evidence for your God, such that we can take that evidence, evaluate it rationally for ourselves, and see if we come to the same conclusion intellectually that you did. Of course, it doesn't work that way because the religious never have any intelligent conclusions. They just really want to believe. They are looking for entirely different things than we are. We want truth, things that are justified in the real world, backed up by objective evidence that anyone can study without having to believe in it first. They just want a comforting fantasy. And so long as that remains the case, where there's a divide that large between the two sides, we are never going to be convinced. And that's their problem, not ours.
In the early 2000s, new atheism gained popularity, driven by figures like Stephen Hawking, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and Christopher Hitchens.
There is no new atheism. That's not a thing. Anyone who says new atheism, you know that person is a moron. The only difference between new atheism and old atheism is that the religious can't shut us up anymore. That's the part that really bothers them. They've lost the social power to shout us down and ruin our lives if we make them look bad. And let's be honest, in reality, the only ones making them look bad are them, because they have stupid, unjustifiable beliefs. The only reason they call us new atheists is because they think we're mean now that we're not controllable. And that's not true. We've always called them out on things. We just have a voice that they can't silence anymore. So please stop embarrassing yourselves in public. You're just making yourself look dumb. Get to your evidence already, because all the buildup is just boring.
Though two have passed, their influence persists through agnostic scholar Bart Ehrman and a new wave of outspoken TikTok influencers. What's notable in the last 5
Wait a minute. Asked 5 years? Do you not even watch your own videos for quality control? And I see this a ton these days. I've pointed it out many times before. People who are putting up so many videos as fast as they can that they're not even doing their own due diligence to make sure that their videos are any good. And that's not just a religious problem. There's one channel I saw a while back where almost every single video they put out had multiple takes that he just left in. He screws up, he starts over, he doesn't go back and edit out the mistakes, it's just the same thing over and over and over and over. On rare occasion I can see that you can make a mistake, but he does it again and again and again, and it never gets any better. I just don't watch that channel anymore because the quality control is so utterly lacking. You have to be at least somewhat professional about this. At least try.
Years is the surge of atheistic ideas on social media. Christianity has lost its appeal, and there's a trend of deconstructing from what's considered toxic Christian doctrines.
We've looked at deconstruction before, and I'm kind of blah on the whole thing. If you mean checking out your existing beliefs to see if they hold up in demonstrable reality, great. That's exactly what I did. I cared about the truth, and I got rid of all the things in my life that didn't stand up to critical scrutiny. However, I do see a lot of people who are just going on pure feelings. Do I like it? Who cares? It's one thing to say, do I like chocolate ice cream? Do I like the styling of this car? That's fine to consult your feelings in a case like that. When you're asking, is this thing true, or is there evidence for this thing, your feelings don't mean a damn thing. It shouldn't matter at all if you like Christianity or not. You should care if Christianity is actually true. And of course that goes for all the other religions as well. And far too many people out there simply don't. It's just pathetic.
These stories of deconstruction, which initially emerged in colleges, have now become widespread, even reaching middle schools. More and more people, millions worldwide, believe that when you die, that's the end.
Because it is. That's what every shred of evidence that we have at hand shows. It doesn't matter what you wish was true, it matters only what is actually true. And we have no reason whatsoever to think that you continue on after your brain dies. In fact, I just had this exact same conversation with a theist who insisted that there just had to be an afterlife. Well, where was his evidence? He had none, at least none that would stand up to any kind of critical scrutiny. But it just had to be true because he wanted it to be. This is why it's such a waste of time talking to the religious. They are not remotely concerned with reality. They just really want to believe. We would never put up with this in most other aspects of life. But I don't want gravity to exist. So what? Too bad. It does. Grow up. But, of course, feel free to jump off the next tall building you come across if you want to test it, because you'll be doing humanity a favor by removing yourself from the gene pool. Maybe once you've plummeted to your death, you will have increased the average IQ of the human species by just a little bit. And we all know it needs it.
No God, no afterlife, no divine plan. How sad is that?
Who cares? Because the facts don't care about your feelings. That's probably about the only intelligent thing that Ben Shapiro ever said in his life. We are after two entirely different things. One is rational, and one is not. If you only care about your childish fifis, then you are doing intelligence wrong. Nobody cares what you wish was true. We care only what is actually true, and we care about the evidence that shows that it is true, at least to the best of our ability to discover it. The religious, they couldn't care less about any of that, and that's the problem. They just want to believe. It's why I really want to find a theist, anywhere, any religion, I don't really care, who actually cares about the truth. Leave your faith and your feelings at home. Just come with evidence that you can back up your beliefs with that shows that your God is actually real. Because none of them can do that. None of them even try. Why? Because none of them give a damn about the real world.
this belief is becoming more popular, even though it's not exactly cheerful. In some places, saying you're an atheist is more common now. But that's not even the most shocking part.
It's not shocking at all. People are much better educated these days, at least in some things. People are much more skeptical these days, at least in some things. And therefore, people don't believe the old-fashioned religious bullshit that people used to believe back when they were all dumb and ignorant. At least not the people who are well-educated and rational, which doesn't tend to be the religious. The people who are neither, those are the only ones still sitting in the pews, and I think we all know the vast majority of those people are old fuddies who didn't have the benefit of a modern secular education, where they focused on facts, mostly, and not on fifis. The shocking part is that there are so many idiots like that left. Luckily, that is changing rapidly. Isn't that great?
According to Phil Zuckerman, who studies society at Pitzer College in California, there are now more atheists than ever before.
Yep, fantastic, isn't it? And if we go with the Pew figures, by 2070, atheists will outnumber Christians in the US by a pretty healthy margin. Your time is coming to an end. Religion will probably never die off entirely, but it is in serious decline, and I honestly don't think it's going to take until 2070 for the inevitable fall to come. Now, I am still personally shocked at how fast religion has fallen. Back in, I don't know, maybe 2000, something around there, I figured it would still take a couple of generations before religiosity would be in a serious decline. That has not happened. Religiosity is in a tailspin, and in many countries across the world, religion is already in the minority. We've talked about that in some depth before, so I don't want to go into it again, but I honestly think that within the next generation, maybe a generation and a half, which is somewhere around 2045, 2050, something like that, religion is barely going to be a thing. I just hope that some of the other irrational stupidity that's going around out there, that isn't going to take its place, but you never really know. But at least for the moment, I think signs are relatively hopeful. Well, if you're an atheist. If you're religious, you're in full panic mode. And you should be, because you're losing.
A survey across 57 countries found that between 2005 and 2011, the number of people saying they're religious went down from 77 to 68%.
It's lower than that now, sometimes far lower. Of course, we've examined those numbers in detail in the past, so I'm not going to waste everybody's time doing it again. But in a lot of countries in Europe, theists are already in the minority. In the US, officially, we're at 64%, but that number is out of date by a couple of years now, and in figures I've seen more recently, I think they suggest we're closer to 55%, but I guess that's still up for debate. In the end, though, religion is dying in the Western world and probably everywhere else as well. The problem is that in a lot of countries where religion, particularly militant religion, still exists, people can't necessarily give their true position for fear of retribution or even death. Even if it's supposedly anonymous, I wouldn't be an atheist in a heavily Muslim majority country saying that I don't believe in Allah, just in case somebody finds out and I get my ass murdered by the religious majority. That's really the problem with a lot of these polls, and as I've said before, you can't really trust polls for anything because most of them tend to be pretty biased. We've looked at a lot of them, and they don't really stand up to any kind of critical scrutiny. We have to assume that people are being honest, but for all we know, religion is already in the minority in the US, but people are afraid to be honest about it and say, yes, I'm really an atheist, because atheism has some pretty negative connotations in a majority religious society. So you can't trust them to be necessarily honest either. Unfortunately, there are still some social benefits in pretending to believe, and until those go away, we'll never really know for sure.
On the other hand, those calling themselves atheists went up by 3, making up about 13% of the world's population.
Again, depending on whether or not those people feel comfortable being honest about their religious beliefs. Plus, this is only counting people who specifically call themselves atheists. Atheism is just the lack of belief in gods, so anyone who doesn't actively believe in any gods is in fact an atheist. Agnostics who don't believe in gods, those are all atheists too, whether they use the word or not. That's what I pointed out earlier. It's not the word that's important, it's the actual position. The number of actual atheists, the ones who do not believe in any gods, is much, much higher. And in fact, if you're calling 68% of the world's population theists, which I think is how I've seen it put before, then by definition, 32% have to be atheists because it's a binary proposition. You either believe or you don't. And if you don't actively believe, then you don't. Therefore, you're an atheist. It's really not that hard.
This percentage has only increased since then. When someone says, there is no proof that God exists, or Christianity is just stories, you should have a response.
Yes, you should. You should be able to present evidence, testable, verifiable, objective evidence that shows that your God or gods actually exist. That's the rational thing to do. It's also the thing that the religious can never ever do. As far as I'm concerned, if you can't do that, if you don't have some demonstrable evidence for the things that you assert are real, then you have no business believing it either. Of course, I can't stop people from believing whatever cockamamie nonsense they want, and I don't even try. I just think it's stupid. I had a conversation a couple of days ago with an atheist who was trying to forcibly change the mind of another atheist who he said had converted for bad reasons. First off, who cares? Yes, in an ideal world, everybody would have good reasons for what they do, but so what? It's none of your damn business what that person does, unless they ask you specifically to help them work out the kinks in their epistemology. Apparently that wasn't the case here. You don't just get to run around and insist other people change their minds. You don't just get to run around and insist everybody uses the words that you like. That makes you an asshole, especially if you're doing it without their stated consent. Don't be an asshole. Enough said.
One way to answer is with the first method, which is called the cosmological argument for God.
Bullshit. It's a dumb argument, and I'm going to tell you exactly why. Now, I'm going to do it when he starts talking about it again, because that makes a little more sense, but this goes for every single religious philosophical argument ever, because they all suffer from the exact same inherent problem. Every single one of them is a giant argument from ignorance fallacy. If you're only proof, since this is supposed to be about proving God to atheists, is logically fallacious, then you shouldn't be using it, should you? Then again, if they didn't, they'd have absolutely nothing to say. Nothing intelligent anyhow, which is why these interactions with the religious go so poorly. Anyhow, get on with your explanation, so I can show why it's so utterly pointless.
It goes like this. First, everything that begins has a cause.
That's actually the kalam. The original cosmological argument omitted the "that begins" bit, and then switched to it because it became obvious that people could just ask what caused God, and the religious didn't like that. There are a lot of quibbles that we can have here after all, because they don't actually know what they claim to know, but for the sake of argument, let's just give it to them because why the heck not? We're nice. Everything that demonstrably begins has a cause. But that doesn't mean that said cause is intelligent, that it's a thinking agent, that it worked with intentionality, or that it still exists. You have to point that out to the religious who are just assuming that said cause automatically is their imaginary friend, along with all the unsupported characteristics and wishful thinking that goes along with it. You can't just assert God. You have to be able to prove God. You have to have evidence that God is actually real and in fact was responsible for whatever the heck you're claiming he was responsible for. If you can't do that, you're wasting everybody's time. But, okay, let's just continue.
Second, the universe had a beginning.
That's, debatable. Yes, our particular instantiation of space-time seems to, but we know that the Big Bang started from a state of intense heat and density, i.e., nothing. So, did the universe have a beginning, or did it just change forms? We don't really know, because this is where the argument really goes wrong one of many, many places. It assumes that things began. They don't. They are just a rearrangement of already existing material. I didn't begin when I was born. What you identify as me began, I guess, but everything that I am came out of stuff that was around before I was. My atoms, at least some of them, came from the death of supermassive stars. We are star stuff after all. The Earth didn't begin. It came about through gravitational forces in the aftermath of the formation of the sun. The sun didn't begin because it's a third-generation star. It came from other stars that lived and died long before it ever showed up. So none of this stuff actually began in the sense that the religious want to believe. It's just a constant rearrangement of existing matter, which makes the entire Kalam totally pointless.
Third, thus, the universe must have a cause, and that cause is God.
I'm going to handle this in two passes because I really have to. First off, as I already said, even if our instantiation of space-time had a cause, you can say nothing about what that cause might have been because we know absolutely nothing about that cause. The religious just assume that it's their imaginary friend, but they've got to prove that, not just assert it. What you want to be true doesn't matter. You have to be able to demonstrate that it actually is true. You have to be able to show a direct, demonstrable causal link between your objectively verifiable cause and the thing that you think it caused. And the religious can't do that. Because you could take the exact same argument and swap out invisible, intangible, universe-creating pixies in place of God, and it wouldn't change the conclusion any. Other than the religious would be really, really sad about that because they're really attached to their God. You don't just get to assert things like that. You have to be able to back it up. And if you notice, the religious aren't even trying. Now, from a purely syllogistic standpoint, this just fails to meet structural validity. The conclusion must arise directly from the premises, and for the argument to be sound, those premises must be demonstrably true, and this fails on all counts. God was never even brought up in any of the premises, thus the whole thing falls apart under the weight of its own stupidity. Big surprise there.
It's like saying even a Big Bang needs a Big Banger.
And that's just stupid to say. This is why he's making this video for other theists, not for actual atheists who would just roll their eyes and laugh just like I'm doing. It's made for dumb people who don't understand how to make logical points and back up their claims with any kind of evidence because they just really want to believe. That is not impressive at all, and if this is the best they can do, and it is, then they've lost before they even begin. Actual reality reflects that, right? And that's why religion is dying.
The idea is that something caused the universe, and that something is God.
But you can't demonstrate that. Why can't that something be magical leprechauns or alien Elvis from another dimension? This is where you have to watch out for the actual crap that the religious are trying to slip past you because they can't think critically about their own beliefs. This is another problem that the religious have. They don't understand that you just don't get to make shit up. Well, that sounds like God to me. So what? That doesn't make it real, and it's the reality that actually matters. Reality must be demonstrable and evidentially supported, and they don't have any of that. That's why I laugh anytime someone says, well, that's God by definition. Whose definition? You don't just get to make stuff up out of whole cloth because you really like the idea. If there is a real God, and you haven't proven that there is, then you got to be able to prove that this God is like you say he is. You can't just say, well, it sounds good to me, because that's just stupid. Where did you get your information on what this real God is like, and how do I find out for myself so I can go and check your work? Don't say the Bible, because that just moves the problem back one step. How did the people who wrote the Bible know any of that? This is always going to be the question, and they have no rational answers. And until they do, they're just wasting our time. So anyway, that's all that we're going to do for the week. This is going to be a pretty long series. Judging right now, it looks like 4 videos, but I guess that can change in the future. Who knows? We'll just have to see. I had to respond pretty heavily to the first part because it was just concentrated dumb, and the more dumb, the more I have to respond, and this looks like it's going to be a doozy. So come back in a week and we'll just keep on going. I don't know why these people are such lunatics, but maybe with your help, we can figure that out together. Let's try. At least it's something to do so the stupidity doesn't hurt so much, even though it really does. I'd love for the religious to prove God exists. Hell, I'd love to see them do anything competently, but sadly, we all know that's not going to happen, because these are not rational people. Not even God, the guy who made today's video. He's certainly not rational. We saw that last week. These are people with real problems, not that they actually care. So let's dive back in and see if this gets any better. Don't be holding your breath because, well, you'll see. We're back with God, or whoever the hell this person is, trying to tell us how to easily prove God to an atheist, and so far he's done absolutely nothing but prove what a bunch of imbeciles the religious really are. Keep in mind, he's got easily in all caps, so you know that's what he thinks is the case. But for the first argument, which granted we did stop in the middle of last week, it was just eye-rolling nonsense based on what he already believes to be true, but can't rationally justify in any way, shape, or form. Somehow, I don't think it's going to get any better from here, but hey, let's see.
Now you might ask, how do we know it was God?
And that was how I ended off last week, if I remember right. It's a question that most of them aren't self-aware enough to ask, so maybe there is something slightly worthwhile here after all. He said the Big Bang needs a Big Banger, and that Big Banger is God. Says who? That's the same thing that I point out all the time with the Kalam cosmological argument. It doesn't even mention God. Any God, yet the religious always pretend that their God must have done it. Says who? That's when you slam on the brakes and start asking a lot of very detailed questions for which they will have absolutely no intelligent answers. So maybe, just maybe, this might be something new, although I'm not going to get my hopes up. So let's get back to the video and see.
Well, that's simple. The universe is everything. Time, space, and matter.
And now I see that I was wrong. This is just as stupid as I should have expected. This is just assuming your conclusion without being able to demonstrate it. You don't get to just define your gods into existence. You have to show that they are actually real first. You can't just assign them characteristics that you really like. You have to show that these real gods that you've already established exist actually have those characteristics in reality. The second they try this, put a stop to it immediately. But that's what we believe means nothing. I don't care what you believe. I care what you can demonstrate is actually true in the reality that we all share. Because I can do the exact same thing. invisible, intangible, universe-creating, timeless, spaceless, fill-in-the-blank pixies did it. Why? Because I said so. Because it's what I believe. If you can make empty claims, so can I. The religious just make fools of themselves, as if that's any surprise. Be creative. Be prepared for them to run away and hide. So anyway, back to the dumb, already in progress.
Now, if something caused all of that, it can't be made of time, space, or matter. This is a big deal. It means that whatever caused the universe exists outside of time, isn't physical, is powerful and smart enough to create everything, and could do it without something else causing it, which only living beings can do.
All of which is just a massive bald rationalization to get where you really desperately want to go. I can say the exact same thing about the pixies though, right? This doesn't get you to any gods, because the pixies aren't gods, they're just immensely powerful imaginary beings. Why? Because I say so, just like he does. So you haven't proven any gods are actually real, much less your specific god, and you've just flapped your lips and made yourself look stupid, which is not really a surprise. I don't know why they're so interested in doing that, because most of them do it. But it's not something anybody should be proud of, but a lot of them are. Because I'll tell you, if you do turn it around on them, they just run away because they have no other options. Or they scream or cry, some get violent, but most of them, they just run away. It's not like they can present any evidence for their gods or anything. I'd be happy to provide evidence for the pixies right after they prove that their gods are real, which they're not even going to try to do. I mean, they started this after all. They should go first. Besides, I don't actually believe it, whereas they presumably do. So, get to it, Christians. Prove any of this is remotely reasonable to believe. Produce your evidence that it's true. Because I don't think you can do it, but, hey, what do I know, right?
But this is not the only way to show that God exists. It's about to get a lot more compelling now. The second way to show that God exists is by looking at what's right and wrong.
Oh, brother, not this again. Nothing is inherently right and nothing is inherently wrong. Morality is entirely subjective. Just hit them with that up front and watch their jaws drop. It's an easy way to short-circuit their stupid moral argument because they don't know what else to say. This, again, is just another empty claim on their part. You might as well poke a bunch of well-placed holes in their bullshit before they waste everyone's time, which I've just done. I do not accept your preconceptions. Your empty claims are not going to be convincing to me unless you have evidence that it's actually true. It's head for the hills time again, because what else is new?
Some people leave Christianity because they think certain beliefs like original sin or eternal hell are really bad. They might even say that God is a vindictive bully or a divine child abuser.
Which, if God was real, and that's a big if right there, that could be true. Of course, we have no reason to think that God is real. The God of the Bible is just a projection from its all-too-human authors upon which all of their own foibles have been stapled onto their own imaginary father figure in the sky. And of course, these are really easy to circumvent too, because it's really obvious what's coming next. Something about, how do you make those determinations if you don't have an objective moral grounding or whatever, something like that. Well, I don't need one. From my own perspective, which I'm not claiming is absolutely right or absolutely wrong, it is socially derived and comes from enlightened self-interest and empathy. I can decide on my own that your God is a dick. I don't need an objective standard for that. I can think for myself, which is something you really can't say for most religious people. But I think I'm getting ahead of myself. It's really easy to do in these videos, so let's take a step back and let him continue.
But guess what? These objections can actually help us see that God exists, and here's how. First, if there are things that are morally wrong, there has to be a standard for what's right and wrong.
See? Told you so. But there is nothing that is morally wrong, at least in a universal objective sense. If is not because, remember? Yet that's all they can really do, isn't it? Here are all the things that I already believe on faith, and because everybody has to be just like me, everybody else has to accept it too. Nope, doesn't work that way. I care what you have evidence for, and you have no evidence for this whatsoever. In fact, the evidence that we do have shows what a load of nonsense these claims actually are. That's why they have to have all the excuses to get around the actual evidence that we really have. If there was an objective standard for right and wrong, then everybody would have that same standard across time and space. There would be absolutely nothing else. There could be absolutely nothing else. If slavery is morally wrong, then there should never have been any slavery anywhere, ever. Yet that's not the case, is it? So they have to invent excuses for why the reality that we see out in the real world doesn't match the claims that they're out there making. If you have to make up excuses, then your whole belief system is laughably wrong. And they can't figure that out, can they?
Second, we can clearly see things that are morally wrong.
Says who? There are things that we can look at from our own subjective experiences and think that they are wrong. They are things that we don't want to happen to us, and because we have empathy for others, we can say we don't want them to happen to other people. But that doesn't mean that those things are actually wrong, objectively wrong. Just because my culture, with its generally similar moral views, thinks a thing, that doesn't make that thing true necessarily. It doesn't make it false necessarily. It just is what my culture thinks it is. Those people over there with a differing view, they could say the same thing, and in fact, often do. So who is right and who is wrong? Again, here come the excuses, because they don't have any actual defensible answers. They just really like the idea, but that means absolutely nothing. What you want to be true isn't true just because you really want it to be true. And the religious seem to have a real problem with that, don't they? So number one fails and number two fails. How bad is the conclusion going to be? Let's see.
Third, thus, there must be a standard for what's right and wrong, and that standard is God.
And that's just bullshit. Again, he's just taking what he already believes and just tacking it on the end. I don't get it, therefore God. Yeah, but that's just stupid. No, that standard is the Pixies or Mickey Mouse or whatever standard you feel like tacking on there. Why? Because I say so. Because that's all they're doing, right? But that's still incredibly stupid. That's why all of these philosophical arguments fall apart, because the religious can't get it through their heads just how laughable these arguments from ignorance actually are. When we say evidence, we don't mean these words that we say that feel really good to us, so they just have to be true. We mean things that you can demonstrate in the real world, that we can examine without having to hold any of your preconceptions first, that show that your God, your specific God, is actually real and exists in some demonstrable way that we can actually see and test for. And they don't have any of that. If I was with this God character, I'd be rolling on the floor right about now. How about you?
Now, for something to be the standard for right and wrong, it needs to be three things.
I bet you it doesn't. I'm trying hard not to read the next part on screen because, first, there is no objective standard for right and wrong. That's just an assertion not based on anything demonstrable. This is why having discussions with moral realists is such a complete waste of time. They spend all of their time trying to smuggle in their pre-existing beliefs, whether that be theology or anything else, and they can't understand that all of their own preconceptions aren't automatically real because they really wish that they were. You don't just get to presume your conclusions without rationally reaching them in the first place, and that's why all of these theistic arguments fall apart as fast as they can get them out of their mouths. They are just assuming things that are not remotely in evidence. They just really want to believe it, but that doesn't make any of it true.
Existing across all time or transcendent?
There's no evidence that any such thing exists. You're going to hear that a lot, I assume, because that's how the religious operate. These are just made-up ideas in the heads of the religiously credulous, but none of it is actually demonstrably real, or at least we have no reason to think that it is. This is the kind of stuff you hear little kids telling stories about, but it's magic. Okay, but that's not real. Granted, these stories aren't meant to be an accurate representation of actual reality, but the yarns that we see the religious spinning, they are, or at least in their own heads they think they are. They need to be looked into with much more detail, and that's exactly where they all fall apart. Once again, this is just, it seems to me, theology, and that means absolutely nothing. I don't care if you really like the idea. I care if the idea is demonstrably true, and something existing across all time, or especially something existing beyond time as they claim, that is just ludicrous.
It has to have the right to tell us what to do. That's authoritative.
Where the hell did you get that one? Because this is another problem that the religious have. They are terrified of their imaginary friends. If I don't bow down and kiss God's ass, he might smite me. But there's no reason to think that your imaginary friend is real. Try proving that before you start quivering in your booties. I don't buy that anyone has the right to tell us what to do, at least once we're adults. As a kid, sure, you are completely reliant on your parents and they have at least some control over your actions, but as an adult, not remotely. Now, yes, there are consequences for violating the law, but you can still do it if you really, really want to, because most of us do, at least for the small laws. Most people speed on the highways. Most of the time you won't get a ticket. Occasionally you might, but the vast majority of the time you don't get caught. You know, cop didn't see it, you didn't do it. Now, I'm not telling you to go out and break the law because, as I said, there are consequences if you get caught, and being a dick is probably not a good way to live your life, but there's nothing authoritative about the government or any individual ordering you to do or not do a thing. They just have legal power over you, and therefore there are consequences for your illegal actions, but otherwise, it's not really a thing, is it? It's just silly.
And it has to be a living person. Personal.
This is the one that's the most laughable because there is nothing personal about reality. This is just what they wish was true. This is what happens when you start with a certain perspective and then insist that everything you already believe must be true, so there. If you watch a lot of these videos, and sadly I do, you will see this all the time. It's just assertion, not fact. It's what they wish was true, not what they can demonstrate actually is. And it's the demonstration that matters, and the religious never have anything to trot out. This is why I am so entirely unimpressed with religious videos, because they're not using their brains for anything but holding up their hats. And most of them aren't wearing hats. Reality works just fine without some magical man in the clouds calling the shots. And I'm sorry if that bursts your irrational bubble, but that's the truth. Learn to deal.
Why transcendent? Because for morality to make sense all the time, the source of morality has to be true all the time. People or groups of people can't do that because we're not always there across time.
Except there is no objective morality. This is just another assertion. And in fact, earlier today, as I'm writing this at least, a theist showed up over on Reddit and said something about atheists not being able to ground objective moral values without a divine being. Okay, that's easy. There are no objective moral values. That's not how anything actually works. Of course, as we see in far too many religious videos, they are so buried under their mountain of irrational preconceptions that it's no wonder they can't understand the world outside. They just really want it to be true. But that doesn't mean that it is.
Why authoritative? The source of morality must have real authority over everyone for it to really matter. Nothing in our universe has that kind of authority.
You haven't demonstrated that your God is even real, much less worth anything. And I'm sorry, but we've read the Bible. Your God is a dick. Of course, this is where the fear comes in, because they're not really concerned about what their God supposedly says, again, entirely unproven and just based on blind faith. They're just afraid of what this moral monster might do to them if they don't kiss its ass sufficiently. This is a very childish way to look at the world. Because I'll tell you right now, if I had to break the law in order to save somebody's life, I wouldn't be considering the consequences in the moment at all. I'd do it in a heartbeat and face whatever consequences might come thereafter. I am not afraid of the consequences. I'm not afraid of doing anything. I just choose not to suffer those consequences if the benefits don't outweigh them. And of course, there are a lot of things that I just have no interest in doing at all. I rape and murder just as much as I want to, which is not remotely at all, because I have no interest in doing that. I'm not afraid of the consequences. I'm not interested in the actions. For the religious, that's not true. They're all terrified all the time. They are little children that have never grown up into actual adults. And that's kind of sad, isn't it?
Why personal? The source of morality needs to be a living being to make us feel like we really have to be moral.
Who cares how we feel? That's really the thing. If there is a God, and that God says, follow these rules or I'll burn you for all eternity, and we have a good evidence-based reason to think that this hell thing actually exists, then we evaluate the consequences versus the benefits of violating those rules, and we make an intelligent decision. We look at that God and say, well, is that God a complete douchebag for imposing this penalty on us for these particular crimes? And pretty much infinite punishment for temporal crimes is never ever a moral thing. But that's, of course, something that we come up with on our own. That is not what the religious are doing, though. I just don't want to get punished. I mean, seriously, just listen to these people. How many theists have you talked to that will tell you flat out that if God told them to go out and murder somebody or rape somebody, because I've actually seen that before, even to like genocide a country, they do it in a heartbeat because God said to do it. They're not thinking, they're just reacting out of fear. But God is going to kick my ass if I don't. Yeah, you're an idiot. That's what these people are, though. Adults know how to stand on their own 2 feet and make their own decisions, hopefully for rational reasons, and accept whatever consequences come of it. Granted, a lot of people don't, but I think there are far more immature children on this planet than actual mature adults, and that explains why things are as messed up as they are most of the time.
We don't have to listen to things like keyboards or chairs telling us what's right or wrong. Now, when you put all of these things together, you get the idea of an eternal, authoritative person outside our universe.
Which you can't show actually exists. This is the big problem with the religious who try to define their deities into existence. Oh, but I want to believe in something that is X, Y, and Z. So what? If that thing isn't actually real, what difference does it make? And that's why I laugh the second they say, God by definition is like this. Well, I'm sorry, but you don't get to just define things as you wish. You have to have a real thing to look at so that you can examine it and determine what its characteristics actually are. What sounds good to you means nothing. I don't care if you really like the idea that a sheep has wings and 8 legs and breathes fire. That's not what real sheep are like. You determine what a real sheep is like by looking at a real sheep. You can't just say, well, by definition, a sheep is like this, because your definition means nothing if it doesn't accurately describe something that you can examine for the details. These people are real idiots. I have no idea what's wrong with them, and if you think you do, let me know down in the comments because I'd really like to understand.
Basically, God.
Because you say so, but that doesn't make it true. And remember, this video is about easily, in all caps, proving God to an atheist. What atheist is going to take this load of horseshit as evidence for anything? Of course, they're not actually talking to us. This is just a means to comfort the already delusional because that's the only thing that actually works. They can't provide any evidence that this God thing of theirs is real, not in any way that an atheist or a skeptic would accept, so they're telling comforting lies to each other in hopes that the truly deluded will stick around and keep giving their money to the churches. That's not anything that you ought to be proud of. If you want to prove God to us, you have to have a whole lot more than your say-so and your childish wishes and dreams and your stupid book that you can't prove is actually true. Let us know when you come up with that, because until then, you're just making us laugh at your own stupidity.
So instead of showing that God doesn't exist, the fact that we know what's right and wrong actually tells us that God must exist.
Except it doesn't, because you haven't shown that a God is real to begin with. You can't just start with, well, it seems to me, and then slap a God label on it and call it a day. You have to show that this God thing of yours is actually real, and you can't do that with arguments. You can only do it with demonstrable evidence. Most of them will just say, but God, by definition, can't be proven. Fuck you. Where did you get that definition? Oh, right, you just made it up. Well, sheep, by definition, breathe fire. So what? They don't, but you can say they do all you want. That doesn't make it true. How do we know that they don't? Well, we go and we look at sheep, and then we describe them as they actually are, not as we wish that they were. This is why the religious are such morons. You'll find a lot of them playing the definition game. God is love. No, love is love. We have a perfectly good word for the electrochemical reaction in our brains that produce emotions. We don't need to call it God. The fact that the religious think that slapping a label on it that's ultimately self-serving to the religion and their churches means absolutely nothing. That cow over there, I'm going to call it God, and now, because that cow exists, therefore you believe in God. Yeah, but that's just stupid. Oh, and the inevitable give money to my church is ever present, right? Because that's really what this is all about. So anyway, we're going to just stop here for the day. It's a little shorter than just chopping this video up into parts, but he ended one section, so I figure instead of starting something else and leaving that in the middle, we'll just leave that for next week. So what do you think so far? I think this is one of the most laughable videos I've looked at in a long time, and that's really kind of saying something, isn't it? Funny, it comes from a channel called God, right? I mean, how fucking incompetent is this God thing of yours anyhow? Maybe that's why this video is getting downvoted into oblivion. I'd say these are some of the worst arguments imaginable for any real God, but they're all like this. This just shows the complete lack of rationality that the religious have. Because they don't care. They just really want to believe. And that's stupid, no matter how many times they do it. So anyway, stay rational, and I'll see you next week. It's another clear indication that the religious are out of their minds, but that's pretty much par for the course, isn't it? They don't understand what it will take to convince actual atheists that their imaginary friends are real. I'm sure they'd have a lot of excuses for why they fail. I mean, we see that all the time. But fail they do, and this is going to be no exception. There's something really wrong with these people. So let's watch the inevitable slide down into insanity coming up next. We're back with God today, or at least someone who is completely whacked out of their gourd, who calls themselves God. And that's not exactly a surprise around here, is it? But this God character seems to think they can easily, in all caps, prove God to an atheist. And this is part 3, and so far, no go. This is just proof that the religious are delusional, as if we didn't understand that before, but hey, I'm willing to give it another go. How about you? So, back to the grind. Please prove God is real in a way that a rational atheist can accept. And I wouldn't be holding my breath if I were you, but let's go see.
But it gets even more powerful than this. The next way to show that God exists is by looking at the historical evidence of Jesus' resurrection.
And there is none. That was easy. Oh, I know he'll come back with the standard religious claims, but none of that stands up to any kind of rational scrutiny, as I'll show when it arrives. My book says a thing doesn't matter. People believe what my book says doesn't matter. You have to have actual evidence independent of your blind faith, and you don't have any. How about actual Roman records for any of it? Do you have that? No, you don't. How about non-Christian demonstrable eyewitnesses to any of it? Do you have that? Nope, you've got none of that either. Let's see some physical remains of anything. Got any? Well, of course you don't. When we say evidence, we mean something like that, and you simply don't have any. That's why you're making all the excuses that you are. We don't want things that you have to interpret as favorable to your faith. We want things that anyone can examine without having to take your faith seriously at all. Come back when you've got something like that, because until then, we are not remotely going to be impressed.
It's interesting how some people talk negatively about early Christianity, saying it was chaotic and that a group made up stories about Jesus becoming God, writing them in the Bible and calling anyone who disagreed a heretic.
You mean like they do today? I think it's funny watching the religious trying to spin it that way, like it was a vast conspiracy to deceive people, when I don't see an awful lot of atheists saying that at all. I'm sure the early Christians absolutely believed what they said, but that doesn't make it true, and it's the truth that matters. That's why we need the actual evidence to begin with, so we don't have to rely on unsupported claims and bald assertions that can't be independently backed up. We are trying to verify the story, and you're just trying to take the story at face value. Never are the two sides going to agree. If we can't validate the story independently of the story itself or the beliefs about it, then we are going to reject it, just like we reject the stories of Elvis still being alive after his death. Either you have evidence for the actual validity of your tales, or you don't. And sadly, you don't. Just deal with it and move on. You can't convince us without it.
Now, even if these claims were true or the Bible got messed up, there are still historical facts agreed upon by most historians and scholars that prove God's existence, and here they are.
But they're not. Because as I keep saying, consensus means nothing without the evidence to back it up. This is never going to go away. I don't care what any individual or group of individuals say. I care what they can present to prove that their conclusions are factually correct. And this goes for everyone. I don't have double standards. One standard is all we need. I am absolutely consistent. Evolution isn't true because a bunch of scientists say it is. It's true because that's what the evidence clearly shows. Every scientist on the planet could have a sudden heart attack and drop dead, and the evidence would still show what's going on. No consensus required. I don't need the people. I just need the facts. And maybe it might help if you had some.
The first fact is that a Jewish rabbi named Jesus of Nazareth was killed by crucifixion by Romans in the 1st century.
You have no evidence for that. That's the claim. That's not the proof of the claim. Where is your evidence to back it up? Now, I agree, it is a pretty mundane claim, but mundane doesn't mean true. It's also a mundane claim that I had pizza for lunch yesterday, but it's also false because I didn't have pizza for lunch. If you care about the truth, then you'd want to verify that with something more than a bald assertion. I don't take assertions as fact. I might not care what you ate yesterday, and I might say, sure, whatever, it's completely irrelevant anyhow, and just move on, but I'm not going to do that with the Jesus claim. Frankly, I think anybody willing to do that is a complete idiot, and that goes for secular scholars as well. There's a huge claim upon which everything else that comes after it is based, so we need to establish that with more than, sure, why not? Now, note that I'm not saying that it didn't happen. I also don't have evidence to back that up. At best, all I can say is, I don't know, and that's true of your side as well. You can't say, well, yes it did, unless you can prove it. The best you can do, the best that anyone can do, is say, who the hell knows? And that kind of does it for the Jesus story, doesn't it? Or at least it should, if people were being remotely rational, which, let's be honest, a lot of people really aren't.
Secondly, after Jesus died, his followers believed they saw him alive again.
You have absolutely no evidence for that since the Gospels were written anonymously. You can't prove that he even had believers because they left no independently verifiable evidence behind. Again, the best anybody with a brain can do is say, I don't know. Besides, who cares what they believed? I care what actually happened, and you have no way to establish that independently. So we're right back at square one, where it's just fifis and faith, and both of those are completely irrelevant. You have to establish that Jesus existed first, and yes, I know that's what he's trying to do, but without a real Jesus, a demonstrable Jesus, something you can verify with evidence, how do you even begin to establish that he had any followers? I mean, without independent evidence that these people were real and not just characters in a book of mythology that eventually got written by non-eyewitnesses to anything at all. I'm trying to get to the actual demonstrable baseline for any of this, and you just don't have one. And that's kind of a problem, right?
The third fact is that their lives changed a lot because of this belief, even to the point of being willing to die for it.
Again, no evidence for that. Most of that is just church tradition. We have the writings of early church fathers who had a vested interest in telling these stories because that's how they made their money. That's how they made their living. They didn't want to go out and get real jobs. But that doesn't make any of these stories true. This is where we're always going to have a problem because these are big claims being made with absolutely nothing of any substance to back any of them up. I reject all of the claims so far as simply being stories. You can't validate them in any demonstrable way. The best we can say for any of it is, we just don't know. But that's not a lot to base a religion on, is it? They have to pretend that these things are established historical facts, because without it, their beliefs go absolutely nowhere. And I think that's really what's going on here, largely, is secular historians realizing that they have to give in somehow, or the religious, the ones with all the power and the control in their discipline, they just won't talk to them anymore, and they lose all credibility and probably the ability to get paid any significant amount of money. That doesn't make any of it true, though, and it's the truth that matters. I don't get why more people don't understand that.
Both James and Paul, who were against Jesus' message, started believing in his resurrection after claiming that Jesus spoke to them after his death.
That's the story anyhow. Paul, whoever he was, since we don't have any evidence of him prior to his roadside conversion, certainly seems to have believed it, but believing it doesn't make it true. We don't have any independent evidence for James, the brother of Jesus, outside of stuff that the writer of the Pauline epistles wrote down. Again, doesn't make it true, does it? We also have some elements in Josephus, but he was unlikely to have ever known the real person, so that's questionable at best. Writing stories about things you were told without being able to back them up on your own, that's kind of doubtful right there. I care only about the truth, and I have absolutely no vested interest in adopting the religion because it makes me feel good.
Lastly, Jesus was buried in a tomb in Jerusalem, and the tomb was found empty shortly after his death.
You have no evidence for that. All of these build one upon the other, and since you can't show that Jesus was ever real to begin with, everything else collapses until you can do that. It doesn't matter what you can get people to agree with for the sake of argument. It matters if you have any actual evidence. The religious must have these things being true, or their entire religion collapses. They must claim that they are true, or everything else they believe falls apart. And I don't give a damn about that. I care if they're actually true, and the only thing we can rely on for their truthfulness is the actual evidence that we have, which in this case doesn't exist. Again, that takes us back to I don't know, and I don't know isn't a good place to start a religious movement, is it? That's why I don't believe any of it.
These are strong facts, but that's not all.
Because they're not facts, not one bit. They are assertions based on faith and the sadly weak thinking of a lot of secular scholars who have to rely on the good graces of the religious to have a job. If you're impressed by any of this, I really don't know what to tell you. However, he said that's not all, so let's see where he's going to go with this. This is exactly why we're not impressed with anything that the religious have to say. It's far too much faith and not remotely enough facts, and I don't accept anything without the facts. And it's really too bad they don't care.
More than 75% of historians agree on all 5 facts, and over 95% agree on the first 4.
Which doesn't make any of it true, because none of these are actual demonstrable facts. Facts require evidential support, and you have none. I don't care about consensus at all. This is why the religious are getting absolutely nowhere, because they have nothing. Even if everything he said so far, even if every single one of Gary Habermas's minimal facts were actually demonstrable, and they're not, that doesn't mean anything. It's why his number of supposed facts keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller as time goes on. That doesn't get you to anything remotely resembling a god. And that's really the thing. Even if you could establish Jesus as a historical fact, which they can't do, that doesn't mean that your religion is worthwhile or true. Even if you could prove that Jesus, whoever this Jesus was, because we don't have any facts whatsoever supporting an actual earthly existence, but even if this Jesus did come back from the grave in some verifiable way, that doesn't mean God done it. You're still stuck taking all of this bullshit on faith, and I don't do faith. Not one bit.
What's interesting is that no other idea except God exists and raised Jesus from the dead explains all of these historical facts.
Sure it does. Even if we grant that those are, in fact, facts, which we know they're not, but who says it's your God? Maybe Jesus was a mutant and just came back like an X-Men. There are tons of other explanations that are possible, but you don't happen to like them, and that's hardly my problem, is it? This is why I tell the religious that they have to walk us through all the steps that they have that got them to their beliefs, and they never ever can. Because they didn't go through any of these steps to get to their beliefs. They just said, God done it, used faith, and that was the end of it. But you can't just say, God done it. You have to show how you got there in the first place. Intelligently, no faith required. Prove God, because God can't just be an assertion. He has to be an established fact with evidence to back him up. Good luck proving that one. It's why I keep saying that you have to demonstrate your own direct causal links. A real God did a real thing that you can show actually happened in the real world, and you can prove that these two things, the real God and the real thing, are actually demonstrably connected, such that one demonstrably did the other. This is not some small claim that people ought to just shrug and say, why the hell not? This is one of the biggest claims that could ever be made, and therefore it must meet the highest evidentiary standards, and you people aren't even trying. The burden of proof is completely on you, and you have all of your work ahead of you. Better get to it if you expect to convince anybody with a brain.
The theories that say the disciples lied, that Jesus didn't really die, that they were all hallucinating, or that records were corrupted, don't fit with these facts.
Except you have no facts. That's the problem. You can't prove that there was a historical Jesus. You can't prove that there were any disciples. You can't prove that any of those stories actually happened as written by the anonymous authors. You just really want to believe. But wanting to believe, that isn't good enough. This is why consensus means nothing. I don't care what you can get a group of people to agree to, especially when that agreement is relatively ill-defined. Are they agreeing for the sake of argument? Are they agreeing because they don't care? Are they agreeing because if they don't, then the majority of scholars won't talk to them anymore and will try to trash them at every turn? Are they agreeing because they want to keep their jobs? Agreeing under any of those circumstances means absolutely nothing. The only agreement that might matter is if they agree that the event actually happened and they have evidence to back it up. That is not the case for any secular scholar that I am aware of or have ever spoken to. If you know otherwise and can back it up, please let me know down in the comments because I'd be really curious to see it.
In short, when we look at what everyone agrees on from history, it leads us to the conclusion that not only does God exist, but also that Christianity is true.
Yet nobody agrees with that outside of the faith. This is sprinting around with the goalposts. First, none of those things are agreed upon by everyone as he claimed. That's just bullshit. Secondly, I have serious questions about the validity of secular scholars who are saying that any of it did happen. Prove it. Why not? Or it's a mundane claim, or well, I'll have to sacrifice my intellectual integrity to get the religious to talk to me. Those are not legitimate answers. If you are going to make a positive statement, then you have the burden of proof to back it up, and that goes for everyone, religious and non-religious alike. It's why I think there are so many word games going on here, and I don't respect word games. If you don't know a thing is true, say you don't know. If you have to lie to get your voice heard, then you need to grow a spine and stand up for yourself. Knowledge doesn't exist without evidence. If you have none, stop making a fool of yourself and stop playing make-believe.
Another important thing to consider is our conscience, a gift given to humans. The Bible in Romans chapter 2 verse 15 mentions,
I don't care about your stupid book until you have evidence that any of it is true. In fact, that all of it is true, because one thing being true doesn't have any impact on another thing being true. You need evidence for both. So we'll be fast forwarding through the verse because it's entirely irrelevant. In fact, everything in this video has been entirely irrelevant. It's just a series of empty claims, not independently defensible, and certainly with no external evidence to back any of it up. He assumed that your conscience was a gift, presumably by his imaginary friend, which is why he pulled out the Bible to begin with. But this is a video about easily proving God to atheists. And let's be honest, no atheist with a brain in their head is going to take any of this seriously at all, are they? If you do, let me know down in the comments because, yeah, I think you've got some problems too.
Humans are unique from animals and plants in various ways, and one significant aspect is that human conscience.
Not really, no. Animals have consciences too. You just have to watch them interact, particularly in more social species, to see it clearly. Of course, the religious want to feel like they're special. They're not, excepting the short bus special, but they've got an emotional attachment to the idea, and they really, really, really want to feel like they're better than everybody else because they just want to be happy. It's an ego problem, not an intellect problem. But your ego doesn't mean anything. It's just an indication that you need to grow the hell up.
We don't just know that we exist, we also understand what is right and wrong.
All of that is simply untrue. First off, we don't know that we exist. We believe it, we have at least some evidence to support it, but we have no actual knowledge. Knowledge requires evidence, and a lot more than we actually have. However, it's the second part that is laughable nonsense. If we just knew what was right and wrong, then nobody would be in prison, would they? This is one more lie that the religious tell themselves because they really wish it was true. But the second that they look at the real world and find out that reality doesn't match up to their emotionally held beliefs, they just have to invent all kinds of fantasy stories and excuses for why it doesn't look like we magically know right from wrong. Is stealing wrong? Then why are there more than 200,000 vehicle thefts just in the state of California alone in 2022? In fact, from 2019 to 2022, vehicle thefts increased nationwide by about 25%. Explain that one for us if you would. Don't go to Pueblo, Colorado, which has the single highest vehicle theft rate in the country at more than 1,000 thefts per 100,000 residents. But sure, tell us how morality is written on our hearts without having to attach a whole bunch of empty excuses for why it sure the hell doesn't look that way. Stop making fools of yourselves. It's really not a good look.
Based on this understanding, we've created a whole system of justice, rewards, and punishment.
None of which would be necessary if everyone had the same understanding of right and wrong. In 2022 alone, there were almost 7.5 million arrests in the United States, and that's down from, say, 1990 levels at 14.1 million. That's a whole lot of people doing stuff wrong, isn't it? How does that work exactly when everybody has the exact same morality written on their hearts? Again, keep your undemonstrated excuses to yourself and just answer the question. And I bet you won't be able to, and nobody will be surprised.
Now let's talk about Jesus himself.
Yeah, let's not. Again, we're skipping over the Bible verses because they just don't matter. This is the same kind of thing that the religious pull all the time. They assume that everybody's just like they are, that everybody cares about their silly book of mythology, and that everyone believes all the things that they do. It's why we know that these "here's how to convert an atheist" videos aren't actually being made for atheists, because we don't take any of these ridiculous preconceptions seriously. Now, we'll get to Jesus in a second, but the last thing you actually want to be doing with an atheist is just assuming that they're just like you are, because they're not. But they don't want to talk to those people, do they? They don't want to talk to any of us. They just want to lie to each other so the money keeps rolling in. Big surprise there.
It could have been easy for God to stay distant from his creation, but he chose to come to earth as a human being.
That's your claim. Let us know when you can actually back it up with more than your flapping lips. How do you actually think that any of this is going to convince an atheist of anything? I can't tell you how many theists I've asked that, and they never have a coherent answer, because they don't actually care about atheists. They want people who are desperately looking for their imaginary friend. They assume that's everyone, but they're wrong. I don't want God. I also don't not want God. I only care about what's actually true in reality. If your God is actually real and you can prove it, that's one thing. But they can never do that, can they? If you want me to believe your God is real, you have to convince me with evidence. Not arguments, not claims, not faith. Evidence. And they're not even trying because they don't care about evidence themselves. They just really want to believe.
Jesus. This isn't just something mentioned in the Bible. Even secular historians like Josephus confirm the historical fact of Jesus' existence.
Josephus did absolutely nothing of the sort. That was an early Christian attempt at forgery. Anyone who did even the slightest amount of research on their own, they'd know that. Of course, these people don't try to research their beliefs because they don't care. It just sounds good to them, and they get a dopamine shot in the brain, so it's just gotta be true. This is why these things are so damn stupid. They're ignorant and proud of it. If they weren't proud, they wouldn't keep making these stupid videos all the time. They wouldn't keep proving what fools they are. And I wouldn't have a 1,300 video backlog. It's really kind of sad.
Jesus not only claimed that God exists, but also that he, himself, is God in human form.
And it doesn't matter what anyone claims. It only matters what can be justified with evidential support. David Koresh claimed to be the return of Jesus. Do you believe that? Tons of people have claimed over the years to be gods in human form. The Egyptian pharaohs did that. Naram Sin of Akkad did that. A lot of the Japanese emperors did that, or at least that they were the divine descendants of the goddess Amaterasu. The Dalai Lamas are supposed to be reincarnations of a god in Tibetan Buddhism. The list goes on and on and on and on. Do you accept that any of that is true? Or are you just cherry picking because you have an emotional attachment to your own particular man god? That just proves that you are irrational. But this whole video does that anyway, doesn't it? Anyhow, this is where we're going to stop for the week, and hopefully we're going to knock through the rest of it next week. This is a very, very long video, which is going to make the SUPERCUT fans happy, as I'm figuring this is going to come out at just about 2 hours. But what do you think for this part of it? Personally, I am not remotely impressed, and this is supposed to easily prove God is real. It's only proven just how stupid the religious actually are, and that's not exactly a surprise. This is why more people are deconverting than are converting, because we're too smart to fall for any of this bullshit. They have nothing at all intelligent to say. And that's kind of sad, isn't it? Can God prove that he exists? Or is that just too much to ask for? Does he even understand the process? I don't think so after watching this, and neither will you. It's no wonder we spend so much time laughing at these religious idiots, because they bring it on themselves. So let's do some more of that. Won't that be fun? Finally, we're at the last video for God trying to easily, in all caps, convince atheists that God is real. And so far, it's been singularly unimpressive, and if you think that's going to turn around in the end, yeah, try again. This might be the dumbest part yet, but it's hard to gauge because the stupidity in all of this is just overwhelming. Therefore, let's get into this once again, with the realization that this is going to be the end of this video, but the religious never stop making more. They're just driving themselves out of business, and that's a very, very good thing.
But does the Big Bang support the idea of God's existence and the Bible being divinely inspired?
Not remotely. Oh, I'm sure he'll read into things because this is what the religious always do. But it sounds like God to me. Yeah, I don't care. You haven't demonstrated your imaginary friend is real yet. Come back when you can do that. It's going to be a long wait, I'm predicting. We might want to take up a hobby. Oh, right, laughing at you people. We already do that. Hobby done. Because none of this is at all original. It's been tried and it's failed before, and the religious just aren't bright enough to figure that out. If we had to wait for something rational and original from the religious, I'd never make another video again. If the religious had to wait until they had something that wasn't already soundly debunked and had evidence to back it up, they would never make a video either. I think that would actually make a much better world, don't you? Let me know what you think down in the comments.
The answer is no.
That's actually surprising. Since we know the Big Bang happened, after all, we've got tons and tons and tons of evidence to support it, then I guess that does away with your silly imaginary friend, doesn't it? Thanks for coming, everybody. Christianity is defeated. Don't forget to tip your waiter. Bye, all! It would be so nice if that was actually the case, wouldn't it? Too bad the religious don't work that way.
Saint John Paul II warned against using the Big Bang Theory to prove God's existence. In 1985, he mentioned that seeking scientific proof of God would be a mistake.
Because you can't do it. You need to, but you can't. This is why religion is dying, because it has nothing of any demonstrable substance to say. It just makes claims, but it can't show that any of those claims make any rational sense. It can't show that they are ever backed up by any demonstrable evidence. It's just what they want to be true, but wanting doesn't mean it actually is. That's why they're never ever talking to us, even in a video like this that says they're talking to us. They only talk to each other because only another delusional moron could ever take any of this stuff seriously. You ought to be able to back up your claims with evidence, and they're not remotely interested. This is really why, the more that I do this, the less interested I am in Catholic theology, because Catholics are probably less interested in reality than anyone else, except perhaps the most hardcore of fundamentalists. They only care what their stupid church says, which means absolutely nothing if the things that their church says aren't true. They're not willing to put any of that to the test, as they should. Why? Because they're all just a bunch of idiots, aren't they?
As it would bring God down to the level of worldly beings. He emphasized that science has limits and cannot confirm or deny God's existence, since God is beyond the material world.
That's your claim, at least. How about you back that up with something more than your own flapping lips? They can't, of course, and this is why I keep making it a point that they're not even trying. I might not say if they made an effort to back any of this up objectively. Even if they didn't succeed, at least they would have made a good faith effort. I have some small measure of respect for them, but since they don't, I just can't bring myself to respect them at all. These are actual real-world claims that have to be justified with verifiable evidence, and they are not making any effort whatsoever to do so. I just have to have faith. Why? Why would anybody in their right mind rely on faith? Because it makes me happy. Now, you remember, this whole video is supposed to be about how easy, in all caps, it is to prove God to an atheist. Has he done anything remotely of the sort? No, not even close. Everything he said has been just statements of faith and wishful thinking, and we expect more than that. He was never serious about that title to begin with. It's just filling his comments with people who are laughing at his ass. He not only doesn't know what atheism is, he doesn't know how to rationally talk to anyone, because his side doesn't care about rationality. And he only cares about his own side. Sad, huh?
This doesn't mean that scientists who believe in God are wrong, but their belief comes from faith or philosophical arguments, not from scientific methods.
Which makes them idiots. Of course, that's something else we've pointed out many times before. Religious scientists use compartmentalization to keep their rational minds away from their religious beliefs. If you hear religious scientists talking about their faith, their entire demeanor changes when they get to religion, because they have to switch off the rational part of their brains entirely so they can say anything at all about their irrational faith. It's like a split brain patient, right? One side doesn't have access to what the other side is doing, and that's not something to be proud of. Oh, and one more thing that I wanted to bring up here, but this channel, at least at the time that I'm writing this, it has 105,000 subscribers. This video has 889 views. Now that's kind of sad, right? I have about 1% of their subscribers, maybe 2. Who knows where it will be when this video actually comes out? But my videos mostly get more views than his do. Keep in mind that as I'm finishing writing the last video in this series, their video has been out for 6 months. I get more views in a day or two than he's gotten in 6 months. The people who subscribe to these channels, they don't actually care to consume the content. And we've noted this many times before. Why is that? If anyone thinks they know, let me know down in the comments, because honestly, I just don't get it.
As particle physicist Stephen Barr puts it, while the Big Bang Theory may be correct, it doesn't necessarily settle the question of whether the universe truly had a beginning. There is a possibility that the explosion 14 billion years ago was just the start of a certain part of the universe, not the entire universe. Over the years, various scenarios and theories, where the Big Bang isn't the ultimate beginning, have been suggested.
Sorry, I don't buy it. The Big Bang wasn't an explosion. Anyone who refers to it as an explosion is an idiot. It was an expansion. Rent a clue. Now, I agree on some of that because I've already made that argument. The Big Bang started from pre-existing stuff. You can't just have heat and density with nothing to begin with. Therefore, there goes Kalam, right? It's just a nonsensical argument, as I brought up way back in the first response video to this video, but it is one of the most common religious apologetic claims around. Why? Because it sounds good to people who have no actual information or interest in reality. It gets them where they want to go, and that's all they care about. That doesn't make any of it true or anything, and it's the truth that actually matters, but that's really all they're after, is coddling their own fee-fees. Well, here's a news flash for you people. It should matter, although to the religious we all know that it doesn't. This is all faith and fee-fees, and that is utterly childish. Not that these people care, because they are, let's be honest, immature children. Maybe it's time to get a grip on reality and realize that what you believe doesn't matter if it's not actually true. And I just don't think that's going to happen, do you?
Were you aware that the Bible sets forth a test to demonstrate its inspiration and establish the existence of God?
Were you aware that it does absolutely nothing of the sort? Empty claims in a book of mythology, they don't matter. That is only going to impress people who already believe entirely on faith, and that's not us. Remember, this is supposed to easily, in all caps, and yes, I'm going to keep saying that, but it's supposed to easily prove God to an atheist, and he hasn't gotten anywhere remotely close. Granted, he has no clue what atheism is. He, like most other theists, likely assumes that everyone is just like he is. Everyone is looking for his imaginary friend because they're just all desperate to believe. And we've seen that from many other apologists over the years, and it wasn't impressive then, and it's no more impressive now. We are not like you are. We don't want your God unless you can demonstrate that your God is actually real in some verifiable, evidence-based way. They've got a ton of excuses for why we laugh at them, but the real reason is because they have nothing to say of any demonstrable substance. They just really want to believe, and atheists don't. We just want to know the truth in a verifiable way that we can know it. And it's too bad that the religious have none of that, right?
This argument and evidence for God's existence are present in specific passages within the Bible. You may say to yourself, how can we know when a message has not been spoken by the Lord?
You'd have to prove that there is a Lord first. As usual, he's just assuming that it's true, but atheists are not going to do that. We expect you to be able to back up your claims with evidence, and, yeah, that's not going to happen, is it? So I'll just let him get back to his Bible reading, but we don't value the Bible at all because it hasn't been demonstrated to be true. Reading to us out of your big book of nonsense means no more than if we read to you out of Harry Potter. You're just wasting our time, and that's all this video has been so far. A gigantic waste of time. Anyhow, go ahead, but it's just not going to get you anywhere.
If what a prophet proclaims in the name of the Lord does not take place or come true, that is a message that the Lord has not spoken. That prophet has spoken presumptuously. Do not be afraid of him.
We're not afraid of you, and all you've done this entire video is presume that you're right without being able to prove that you're right. Now, I'm guessing that he's going to try to use prophecy, which is painfully simple to debunk, but at least he's trying to do something in the last 2 minutes of his video, which is more than I can say about the first 10. Yet, he doesn't understand that this isn't going to impress atheists either, because we're not presuming that his imaginary friend is real. Even if there was a demonstrable prophecy anywhere in the Bible, which there isn't, but let's just say there is for shits and giggles, that doesn't prove God done it. That's an entirely separate claim that he'd have to use evidence to back up, and we all know he can't do that. So this isn't going to work for you either, not that we should be at all surprised. How can these people be this dumb? Someone please explain.
Present your case, says the Lord. You idols, tell us what is going to happen. Declare to us the things to come. Tell us what the future holds, so we may know you are gods.
So, how exactly do you explain all the crap in the Bible that never happened at all? You know, Matthew 16:28. Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. No, they'd rather just make up excuses for why that one doesn't count, because otherwise they'd have to admit that Jesus wasn't worthwhile, and they can't have that. Because that's how this stuff always works, doesn't it? They're just a bunch of hypocrites, because what else can they do? What else indeed? Well, they could, I don't know, try to be consistent, try to be honest, try not to be hypocrites. But the religious never are, right? They're too busy shucking and jiving to get to what they wish was true, to care about what is actually true. This is why my book says a thing will never impress anyone. How is this going to easily, yes, in all caps, going to prove God to an atheist when we have no reason whatsoever to believe anything in the Bible? They won't have any answers to that, so let's just move on.
The Bible's test is simple, yet it states that a message claiming to be from God should be supported by predictions about the future.
I don't believe your God is real. I have no reason to do so. There isn't a single demonstrable prophecy in the Bible or anywhere else. It's just weak sauce claims that are not specific enough to be taken seriously, and the religious just don't like that. I don't care what your book says. I care about your evidence. And you don't have any. That's the problem. You need evidence, and you have none. That's why I'm not going to be convinced by your silly book and your pathetic claims. If this is what you expect to convince atheists, then you don't have the slightest clue what the hell you're doing. Not that that's any surprise or anything because, well, religion, you know.
The logic behind this is that if God exists, he knows the future.
Says who? Because that's just a claim. There are tons of gods out there that are not said to know the future. But they're still supposedly gods though, right? Plus the fact that you have no way of knowing what this imaginary man in the sky you worship is actually like. These are all just empty claims. Saying, but I really like the idea, doesn't make that idea true. It's why you have to be able to take yourself completely out of the picture, and the religious can't do that, because without them, the picture doesn't even exist. This is just, but I like it. Okay, but what does that mean? Not a damn thing. So you telling me what your God is like without being able to show how you know that, without being able to demonstrate that it's actually true, that is not going to impress anyone. You still have to produce your God for independent observation so that we can test it and see what it's actually like. When do you think you're going to be able to do that? Because until you can, you've got nothing. Nothing at all.
While people can make educated guesses, consistent and accurate predictions about the future are beyond our capabilities.
Yet, your imaginary friend has made no consistently demonstrable predictions. I'm not aware of any specific prediction in the Bible that has ever demonstrably come true. Not one. Now, there are a lot of vague ones, some not even intended as prophetic, but if you squint at it just right and have a whole bunch of unjustified preconceptions, you might be able to claim that it came true, but it didn't, not demonstrably so. We can do the exact same thing out of other religious books, and, well, heck, I've seen people make the case that Gene Roddenberry was a prophet because he predicted the cell phone. I mean, he didn't. He made something that he thought looked cool on a TV show, and people watched the show, thought it was a really good idea, and then they worked to make it happen in reality. That's not a prophecy, that's inspiration. That's why any legitimate prophecy needs to be incredibly specific. Names, dates, places, things such that no person or persons can see the prophecy and work to bring it about. That's why Old Testament prophecies like Jeremiah 16:15 that said that Israel will be reborn, that means absolutely nothing. When you have millions of people reading the Bible and then working hard to make that supposed prophecy come to pass, that's not prophetic. That's bullshit. It happened because people made it happen, just like people made cell phones happen. This is just not impressive at all.
False gods, being unaware of the future, cannot make such predictions.
We have no evidence that any gods exist at all. This is just the assertion that's being made. It's why anyone claiming that Gene Roddenberry ought to be a saint, or I guess you can do it with Arthur C. Clarke, who predicted GPS and satellite TV back in 1956, that doesn't make any of it prophetic. I mean, Clarke foresaw the existence of satellites, period, back in a letter he wrote in 1945. That doesn't make him a god. It just makes him creative. It makes you people idiots. And this isn't going to convince any rational person of anything, except that you're all just a bunch of loons.
Therefore, a message can be identified as coming from God based on its ability to predict the future.
Nope, because you haven't established that any gods exist in the first place. You have something written down by ancient people, not by gods. These vague claims just so happen to come true. In a lot of cases, it wasn't even intended to be prophetic in the first place. People just read into it later on and reinterpreted it to be a prophecy. But that doesn't mean it was one, and it doesn't mean it came from any gods, much less your own. This is just reading into stuff, and it's absurdly common in religion. You haven't established that any of this actually came from any gods in the first place. You just haven't. Even if you found someone who is consistently giving accurate prophecies day in and day out, things that were very specific, that mentioned dates, times, people, etc., 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 and never got anything wrong, that doesn't mean they came from your God. You have to demonstrate that, and you're not even trying. Asserting is not proof of anything. It's just proof that you're a moron. And you really ought to knock that off.
If the message indeed predicts the future, it indicates come from God, and consequently God must exist. This serves as evidence that God is present and communicating with us. The Bible's argument for God's existence is clear and direct.
No, it's not. You're just making yourself look stupid. This is just, I believe it, so it's just gotta be true. Says who? This is the religious just assuming that everyone has the same unsupported preconceptions that they do. And we don't. This is why I keep saying that they have to walk us through the steps. First, prove that anyone has ever issued a prophecy, ever. Make sure it's impressive. It's got to be extremely specific and not fulfillable by any human or humans down the road. If you said that there would be a volcanic eruption in X place at Y time on Z date, and it would kill this many people, and it was made demonstrably 100 years or 1,000 years, whatever, before the actual event, Yeah, I might be impressed. And of course, you'd have to be able to do this repeatably because anyone can get something right once. Show me that one first. I'll wait. Then you'd have to be able to prove that this kind of prophecy came from any god. You'd have to be able to prove that gods were real first. And then, once you had established the verifiable existence of any gods, you'd have to prove that your God, your specific God, the God that you worship, exists, and that your God was demonstrably responsible for the prophecy. You can't just assume it, you can't just assert it, you have to be able to prove it. Get to work. That's the kind of thing you people would need to be able to do, and you've done absolutely nothing remotely of the sort yet.
It's great that God has shown clearly that he exists for anyone who thinks honestly about it.
And that's their get-out-of-jail-free card. Anyone who doesn't buy into their theological bullshit, they can just impugn their honesty. No, you just haven't done the work that needs to be done in order to prove that any of this stuff is true. You're not even trying. This is where your faith in fifis come into play, and I am not remotely impressed with that. That's why I need to see your facts and evidence. Nothing less will do. Just because you really like the idea, that doesn't matter. Reality doesn't care about your emotional state. Reality is what it is. Prove that your claims are aligned with actual reality by using facts and evidence to do so. Go ahead. We're waiting.
According to Romans chapter 1 verse 20, since the world began, we can see God's invisible qualities like his eternal power and divine nature just by looking at what he made.
My book says a thing. Who cares? This just assumes a lot of things not in evidence, as Allison would say. You can't just make assertions. You have to be able to back it up, and these people never ever can. That's why all of this just makes atheists roll our eyes. We're not against the idea of your God necessarily. You just haven't proven that your God is real in the first place. And with arguments like this, it's very clear that the religious just don't care. Well, of course what we believe is true. Okay, prove it. Well, we don't have to prove it because we're right. Prove it. We're right. I mean, that's all this ever is. It's just wishful thinking thrown out there by credulous idiots who couldn't care less about the facts. We care. Atheists care. They don't. And that's kind of the problem, isn't it?
Everyone believes in something. When an atheist says they don't believe in God, they usually mean they don't believe in a specific kind of God.
I don't believe in any kind of God. None of the God claims I have ever been presented with in my life make any rational sense whatsoever, nor are they supported by any evidence that anyone has ever presented. That's the problem. If you want me to believe, then you have to demonstrate to my satisfaction that what you're saying is true. I don't have any double standards. The one that we already know works, that we have already demonstrated works repeatedly, that's all I will personally ever need. And if you can't demonstrate things to my satisfaction using that standard of evidence, then you are not going to convince me. That's a you problem. It's not a me problem. I'm not the one with the unreal standards here. I'm not the one expecting things that you shouldn't be able to present. You are the one that needs to get to work. And maybe you ought to get on that pretty quick.
Like one who acts like Superman, rewarding good people and punishing bad ones.
That's the one in your stupid book, but just like Superman, that cannot be demonstrated to be actually real. If someone told me to look up in the sky, it's a bird, it's a plane, I'd be asking for the exact same level of evidence for Superman as I am for your God. Superman isn't real, and so far as we can tell, neither is your God. If you want to convince me, then all of that work is on you. You have the burden of proof, and sadly, you're not even trying to meet it. This is why I am so unimpressed by the religious. They couldn't care less if their claims were actually true. It just makes them feel good and gives them that dopamine hit in the head, so they insist it's gotta be true, no matter how dishonest they have to be to get there. but I'm not dishonest. I'm very simple in my expectations. Put up or shut up. Pick one. Stop making a fool out of yourself.
This kind of God allows bad things to happen, like genocide or hurting kids. In the Armenian Orthodox view, God is described simply as love. So when we see love in our lives, in a child's smile, someone helping at a cancer ward, or a friend giving you a hug, we're seeing God.
Bullshit. We have seen for 4 videos now, you just making a fool of yourself. You don't get to just redefine terms and say, see, that's God. No, that's a human being doing something that your imaginary friend seems entirely incapable of doing, since there's no reason to think that your imaginary friend exists at all. That's the problem. You can't just arbitrarily redefine your terms. You have to produce evidence that your claims are factually correct, and you can't do that. This is why you look so stupid to everyone outside of your ridiculous cult. Because you are.
Love has been around forever and will never go away. So when you talk to someone who doesn't believe in God, don't just use words. Show them by living a life that's all about love, helping others, being kind to everyone, and reaching out to those who need support. That's a better way of saying, hey, look, God is real.
No, it's just a way of proving what a complete imbecile you are. Now, yes, go ahead and live a decent life. Care about other people. Leave your imaginary friend out of it. This is why the religious spend so much time making complete fools of themselves, because it's really all they can do. They are so busy living in an imaginary fantasy land in their heads that they can't handle just existing in the actual reality that they do, whether they like it or not. The only thing God here has proved is what a complete dipshit he is. He's just making everybody laugh at him. What the hell else is new, right? Because they don't understand basic skepticism, and they certainly don't understand atheists. We are nothing at all like you. We're better. We're smarter. We're more rational. Maybe you ought to give that a shot. I mean, at least try. So anyhow, what did you think of all of this? Because it turned out to be a very, very long series of videos, because there's just an endless supply of complete stupidity on display. Granted, they're not making any of this for atheists, even though they're playing make-believe, because atheists are just rolling our eyes. They're just making this for their paying customers who really want to think that they have a defense against skepticism, which, sad for them, they really don't. This is all about fifis and faith, and that means absolutely nothing to anybody outside of your stupid cult. So just go and fuck off. You are the reason that religion is dying. Good job on that, I guess. Being a complete idiot isn't helping your cause. Although, since your cause is irrational and idiotic, I mean, go ahead and keep it up. It gives me more videos to point at and laugh at, and it hastens the end of the religious bullshit. So yes, by all means, go right ahead. You have my permission. Continue making a complete fool of yourself. Make the world a better place through your own extinction. At least they're doing something right, right?